America is a country founded on the idea that individuals ought to have the freedom to be in control of their own
Mm-hmm.
lives.
Yeah.
If you feel that sense of agency, if you are making active choices, if you are in control of where you are headed, you're likelier to be able to commit, to feel the security, the stability, even if it's residential instability, right? Even if you're
Yeah.
moving a lot, two people can be partnered and maintain a stable relationship.
This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I am Frank Schaeffer. And my guest today is Yoni Appelbaum, and he is an author of a book that I've just read that we're going to be talking about called Stuck. He's also deputy executive editor at The Atlantic magazine, which we say on this show is without any peer, our favorite publication, period. That's it, no qualifications. He's also a social and cultural historian of the United States. Yanni is the author of Stuck. That's the title, subtitle, How the Privileged and the Propertied Broke the Engine of American Opportunity. And this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. Please subscribe right now on YouTube where you're watching this live or as a recording later, and go to Frank Schaeffer at Spotify and Apple Podcasts. I have a Substack page, it has to be said, where I make, various kind of statements, and you can go to substack.com and do that. Okay, so I've spoken to a bunch of your colleagues at The Atlantic, David Frum, Tim Alberta, Faith Hill, and we love The Atlantic. I love The Atlantic. And I want to get into your book, but first of all, I just want to say, sort of a matter of interest to me, is that something I grabbed from the back of your book that I want to read as a kind of an open, and then we'll take it more in order. This book began more than a decade ago. I think this actually comes from your acknowledgments in a triple-decker in Cambridge, where I looked at my children and wondered whether the world I would pass on to them would offer the same opportunities as the one I had inherited. And then jumping into another part, I think maybe this is from the front of your book. The house I live in today is the 15th residence I've occupied in my life, already putting me a few moves above the American average. I have no particular desire to move again. I love my home. I love my neighbors. And I would be perfectly happy never to wrap another set of dishes in old newspapers. Now, Yanni, the reason I quote those two things is because the way you set the book up makes you kind of the opposite of my life experience. And at the same time, we're exactly on the same page. We're on the same page because in your acknowledgments, you start with your children. And I always start with my children and grandchildren. I'm at the stage of my life where I have five grandkids and three kids. Where we're the opposite is I'm 72 years old, and aside from British boarding school and some professional stints, like living in South Africa for a year to direct a movie, I've lived in three houses. And the house I live in now, which was settled, the property was settled, I think, in 1670 something by the Coffin brothers. This property's had three owners, in other words, three families since
Wow.
1600. And I'm the fourth owner here. And Jeannie and I, my wife and I, who have been together for 55 years, have lived in this house for 47 years. And a few years ago, I wrote a piece which was something like, have babies, get married, all these kinds of things, and stay put. My point being that the kind of instability of always chasing more money and more projects doesn't necessarily help a marriage. So it was nothing to do with what you're writing about, but I kind of drew an opposite conclusion. So I've come to your book from the point of view that I love your book and I agree with what it says, but I kind of want to start with a personal aspect and then get into your argument. And the personal aspect is this, and that I've found that people's experience first leaving home and going to college, and then they have that group of friends, and then they move on and they chase jobs and they move locations less than people did in the past, as your book points out, may have something to do with some of the demographic decline we have in people having children and starting families. Because one of the reasons, for instance, that my son moved to this neighborhood and has had three children who live across the street that I do childcare for is he knew I wasn't going to move. He grew up here. He likes the neighborhood. He wanted to be here. And basically, he had been in the Marine Corps. He fought in Afghanistan. He went to the University of Chicago. And after all that, he said, hey, life is short. I want to settle down and get married and have kids. I want them to grow up in my neighborhood. So I just want to start with saying that we are on the same page when it comes to children and families. Before we get into your argument, which I think you make terrifically well and completely convincingly, so this is not, I'm not arguing with you. I just want to talk about that one aspect of kind of the larger picture of stability and family life, and how you see your argument in your book saying people used to move more and were more mobile. How did they all stay married and have families when today people move less and at the same time seem unable to settle down with anything they're doing? And you have this sort of long love process and they look for the right person and they're in their mid 30s, or maybe they're freezing their eggs and figuring if they want one child. And I'm trying to see how your book fits together with that sort of demographic picture of an unsettled population. And of course, that doesn't even take into account the Trump period we're in. So I just throw that out. There's a lot of stuff there.
Yeah.
Sorry to load it on, front load this, but I'm so interested in you because I love the book and we're going to get into it. But I thought I would just toss all that out, a kind of a life philosophy question first.
For sure. And everything you're saying makes perfect sense to me. I'm jealous that you've got a house with that kind of history, that you've got a community that you love.
Yeah.
I will in another few years be jealous that you've got grandkids. My kids are not quite old enough for me to freight them with that expectation yet,
Yeah.
but soon. And I mean, that sounds wonderful. And I think that those are what I'm pushing ahead in the book is thinking through a kind of a balance in life, right? That moving, and we'll talk about this, can be incredibly powerful. I think it's the thing that made this country so distinctive, so prosperous, so pluralistic. But it's an important caveat. It matters why you're moving. It's not particularly beneficial to be displaced out of a area where you're desperately trying to hang on. It's not so beneficial to be chasing something and not what, to the extent that the moves that impel you forward are out of a sense of deep dissatisfaction and inability to commit to anything. An alienation from one community that leads you to try another. That's not necessarily great either. And you can see, over the last 50 years, as Americans are having fewer kids, as they're struggling to form and maintain stable relationships, it's also the period in which they're moving a lot less. And it is particularly actually the parts of the population that are moving where the decline has been particularly steep in mobility that we see these problems have become particularly acute. And to me, what it traces back to, and the way I would square this circle, and it's such a great question, is America is a country founded on the idea that individuals ought to have the freedom to be in control of their own lives. If you feel that sense of agency, if you are making active choices, if you are in control of where you are headed. And it doesn't mean that you've got perfect control. None of us do, right?
Sure.
There's all kinds of forces that act on us. Then I think you're likelier, well, we'll talk about this. There's all sorts of positive benefits that flow from it. But one is you're likelier to be able to commit, to feel the security, the stability, even if it's residential instability, right? Even if you're moving a lot, two people can be partnered and maintain a stable relationship. I think of one set of grandparents where he got drafted and sent through West Point, and the Army 10 years for that, and that the Army is not really big into residential stability. They moved from base to base, but it was a happy and stable marriage. They were committed to each other. The home traveled with them from Army base to Army base in those years. And it was hard and it was stressful, but it was also
something
generative.
That interested me, a sort of a through line in the many stories you go into in terms of the Lower East Side, New York, and settlement patterns and immigration. By the way, I re-immigrated to the States because my parents were Americans, but I was born in Switzerland in 1952. And then in 1980, my wife, who's from California, so that's a big move. We lived in Switzerland for 10 years and then moved back here. And we moved very much like people in your book. And that was the last year I was in Europe. I was sort of traveling to the States for work, and we moved for work. But the motivation was so that I could be with my family more. And so it also followed with the stories in your book, which are sort of different than the stories people are telling with their lives today, in that it seemed to me that a lot of the people in your book back in the 1920s and 30s and 40s and so forth and so on, were moving precisely for the good of an already established family. They were trying to do better for their children and their family. They had a goal in mind that wasn't just about career orientation, it was about a life. And maybe we should start there, because I think some of that has changed in our culture. People are very career oriented, but the goal is the career a lot of the times. Whereas a lot of your stories, including your own family story, besides Jews surviving the Holocaust and the drama of that kind of a move, the running away from persecution, which is a bit piece of American history, it seemed to me that the motivation on a lot of the moves that you talk about in your book was to strengthen and support a family as a goal in itself, as a kind of a good in itself. Whereas today, the emphasis maybe when people move is more for career advancement and a sort of a vacuum of relationships. And there
Yeah,
seems to be
and
a lot of ennui about that.
yeah, and I've got nothing against people who want to move for a career. I have moved, but for me at least, the career motivation has always been tied to that larger
Yeah,
goal. Um, am I going to put myself in a better position to provide for my family?
yeah,
And that's a powerful motivator. My first ancestors who came to this country were fleeing religious persecution. They came over on the Mayflower,
yeah,
and they came though not just because they were fleeing religious persecution, but also to establish a community
yeah.
to care for their families, right? But those were intertwined. So it's rarely when you ask somebody for their story of immigration to the country, do you get just one factor, one
One
cause.
aspect. So
Um,
let me just tell people a little bit about the book here. Stuck: How the Privileged and the Property Broke the Engine of American Opportunity. And one big through line in this book is this is not a left-right divide. This is somewhere where the progressives, quote unquote, for both environmental reasons or just NIMBYism or whatever, have very much joined the throng of people who have limited opportunity in America. And I find that particularly in the context of Trump winning the presidency, which is a kind of a sub question I'm going to bring up at some point. I'll just throw it out there now. This idea of deregulation, whether it's zoning or building permits, seems to fit at least part of your agenda in terms of the kind of thing that Trump and Musk are talking about. And I'd like to get to that later, but that's not how you wrote your book. But it's an interesting point, because a lot of the Republican platform now would be favorable toward the kind of deregulation when it comes to zoning that you talk about. But anyway, part one, chapter one, A Nation of Migrants, chapter two, The Death of Great American Cities, chapter three, Freedom to Move, four, A Migratory People, five, Dirty Laundry, six, Tenement Phobia, seven, Auto Emancipation, eight, The Housing Gap, nine, A Plague of Localists, Building a Way Out. And then you say, today, the United States combines increasingly European levels of geographic immobility with American style parsimony, delivering the worst of both worlds. We neither help workers move toward opportunity nor do enough to provide for them when they can't. The United States has weathered many shifts in the distribution of opportunity only to emerge more prosperous than ever. And most economists expected that workers who lost their jobs through the shocks of environmental regulation and free trade with Mexico and China would find new and better opportunities. The models, though, were validated against historical data and failed to account for new barriers to mobility. So that's sort of how you sum the book up, but and we'll get into specifics. But anyway, if you just want to talk a little bit about the scope of the book, using my
yeah,
intro there as the background.
I'm so glad you chose that quote. The big picture I'd love for your viewers to understand is that this was something remarkable about the United States, that in the old world, you were born into a fixed place in physical terms, usually into a village where your ancestors had lived for generations, where you expected to live, where you expected your children, your grandchildren to remain, and a fixed place in the social hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
Your identity was inherited. Your
Yeah.
prospects in life were largely inherited. They were fixed. You didn't really have the chance to change them. In the United States, we invent, just as a legal right, the
Mm.
freedom to move. And this was fascinating to me. In the colonial era, you didn't actually have the right to settle down someplace.
Mm.
It didn't matter if you'd bought a house. It didn't matter if you'd gotten engaged to a girl in town. The town could warn you out. It could say, we don't want you here. you're not welcome to stay. And many colonial towns warned out half or more of all the people who tried to settle there.
Or
Towns were
conversely,
member-only
you talk
clubs.
about Winthrop telling somebody, "Hey, you can't move. We don't want you to move."
Yeah,
He wants to go down the street to Connecticut or someplace.
that's exactly right, right? So like you didn't necessarily have the right to go, you didn't necessarily have the right to stay. And
Yeah.
by about 1800, we put those two rights together, the right to move, to leave, the right to stay, and we put them together into a freedom to move.
Hmm.
And this is revolutionary. And Americans just start moving all over the place. You know, in our mind's eye, we may imagine sort of Conestoga wagons streaming out to the frontier. And there
Yeah.
was some of that, but most
Yeah.
Americans lived in communities like the one you're in, which
Can
had
I
been
just go
settled
back to
already for a
one
couple
point about
centuries. Yeah.
Winthrop and the Bay State Colony? Because I found this very interesting. My dad was a theologian and a Calvinist and a missionary and all the rest. So I always my ears perk up at mentions of things that I grew up hearing about. I think there's a sort of a basic, piece of misinformation out there, if you want to put it in today's terms, where this idea of a Christian America, let's get back to the founders, and they sort of mean they have this romantic ideal of the Bay State Colony, but actually the founders were everything but libertarians. They were certainly not. And I love the point in your book where you talk about Winthrop being against mobility, and their idea of settling here was not, hey, we've all left England to be Americans. We've left England to make an even purer, homogenous community of insiders. You're not going to leave, and we're not necessarily going to accept anybody new here. And so let's start with the transition, because you've already mentioned it briefly, but I really want to dive into this. What changed between the Bay State Colony that I'm looking at right here across the Merrimack River, with our little common green over there in the town I live in, to the idea of mobility and the vast immigration pattern that then began to reshape America into the nation we know now? I just think this is a very it's a piece of history that is not known very well, and I'd really like to go there first. Just that change from the Bay State Colony, the closed little fundamentalist, if you want to put it this way, community of Calvinists, to what we had in the 18th and 19th century.
Gosh, you put that so well. You know, they really don't intend to create a libertarian paradise. It's all about control, right?
Yeah.
These are covenanted communities. But revolutionary ideas have a way of twisting back on their authors in ways that they don't expect. Once Winthrop has said it's okay for all of us to leave together and go from England to New England,
Mm-hmm.
others say, okay, well, if it was okay for you to leave England, maybe it's okay for me to leave too.
Mm-hmm.
And that chain of moves kicks off. And whenever there's a problem, whenever there is discontent in the Bay Colony, they go and they plant another town. They launch another settlement, which gives people that outlet. So that's the first step in this process is instead of people being assigned to a place of birth, assigned to their identities of birth, they're moving. But that, as we've said, doesn't mean they're welcoming you in. It's a pretty closed off place. The second part of it is where they push over the Appalachians in the early American Republic, right? We've got the United States now. There's this Northwest Reserve, this big chunk of territory that belongs to the federal government, and it's open for settlement.
Yeah.
And what the territories find is that they're competing for residents. If Ohio doesn't want them, Illinois
Mm-hmm.
does. And if you're going to compete for residents, you can't get too snobbish about it.
Yeah.
If the town is forever warning people out, if people don't know whether if they buy a plot of land in your town, they're going to be able to
Yeah.
come and live on that land. They're not going to buy it. And so the towns start shifting how they regulate this. They say, okay, anybody who comes can establish residence just by choosing to establish residence. So it
Mm.
becomes a matter of your intent as an individual. If you want to live in this town and you say, I'm living here, I'm
Yeah.
here now, you live there for a certain number of days, you're in. The
Mm.
town no longer has the right to say, we don't want you here. And it's a small change done on the frontier in order to
Yeah.
compete for residence, but it ripples back. And suddenly, everybody has that freedom. The freedom comes back, ripples back through the older states. And by the middle of the 19th century, probably 1 out of 3 Americans is moving every year.
Yeah.
It's just this, when people are freed for the first time in world history, really, to shape their own lives, to get that sense of agency
Mm.
by relocating, they lean into it with sort of wild abandon. Europeans who
Yeah.
come over just can't
Are
believe how
shocked.
much we're moving.
Yeah.
It's weird.
I have a question to get to one of the big points of your book, that segues directly from what we're talking about. Okay, so that's the transition from the Bay State Colony, Winthrop, and so forth. And now you get to the modern transition that I'm putting in very general terms, and I can go to quotes in your book, but I'd rather have you tell us than just read bits of your own book back to you. All right, there's this kind of unintentional collaboration between progressives with zoning for many reasons and redlining and the kind of racism that went with keeping Black people, people of color out of neighborhoods. There's a weird symbiosis there that I'd like you to explain. And then the origins of the present tense and what would need to change for the future. Because I live, for instance, in a neighborhood that is white mostly, and it's not by design in the sense that this wasn't redlined in here in this part of Massachusetts, but it might as well have been because of the prices of the houses. People don't move because they're priced out, and they're priced out because I'm in a historical zone that you can't do anything with. And then, God forbid we build some multifamily homes here or a building. And then you go into these horror stories from California of, projects that are delayed for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. There's there's some residents that have to move out because you have all these locals suing. So what has happened to the progressive movement that it has become now the anti-mobility movement? What was that story about? And how does it unintentionally fulfill the dreams of the people who were redlining and trying to keep neighborhoods all white? And it's sort of all become the same thing. I think that's a big point in your book that'll shock a lot of people who think of themselves as progressives and on the right side of history. And in this case, you're telling the progressives, no, you were very much on the wrong side of history.
Yeah, it's you have to go where the evidence leads you, and so this wasn't necessarily the story I set out to tell, but it's the one that I found in the archives and in communities across the country as I reported it. So we're going to do this in 3 steps because that's a big question you've asked. First, we're going to go back to the original progressive era, right? This is the beginning of the 20th century, and reformers want to use science and expertise and reason to bring order out of chaos. They're looking around at problems. They're looking around at the chaos of urban areas that are filling with immigrants. And it's all messy and organic, and they don't like it. And zoning is, it's initially a solution that comes about as a way to segregate minorities. I mean, it's just that simple in the United States context. It starts in Modesto, California in the late 19th century as a way to push the Chinese back into Chinatown. That is, that's not me imputing motive.
Right.
You can find people at the time saying things like, we all understood this was just a pretext to segregate the Chinese, like they say it in their own words.
Yeah.
And then it jumps to the East Coast in New York, where it's a way to push the Jews back into the Lower East Side. And again, they just say it. And then it spreads nationally and takes on a variety of purposes. In some cases, it's a way to keep Black people out of white neighborhoods. In other cases, it's about economic segregation. It's about keeping the poor, immigrants, out of affluent neighborhoods. But it's that order from chaos. It's the separating out of unlike things. And to me, at least, one of the things that's great about this country is that it mixes together unlike things.
Yeah.
So that's the first complicated story of zoning. It's solving lots of actual problems in urban spaces, but it's solving it with a set of remedies that are going to be complicated.
Well, they reinforce both class and race and economic incomes, and just say that.
That's exactly right. And so, you're separating people out in America. If you're separating by class, you are also separating by race. The second stage gets us to FDR and the New Deal. And the New Deal is a problem to solve. And again, this is a real problem, just like the problems of early 20th centuries were real. They've got a mortgage crisis. This will be familiar to anyone who lived through 2008. The banks are failing. People are defaulting on their loans and walking away. And the clever solution that FDR comes, he has no money to pay for all of this, but he says, look, what if we just take the loans and we stretch out their terms? Mortgages were often like 5 years. So they could be 20 years. They could be 30-year loans. And that would get the payments down to be the same as rent or a little below rent. And then why walk away from your mortgage? You're paying the same as you would to rent anyway, and you can own the house at the end of the term. And so that solves the problem, but it creates a new problem, which is, now the federal government is on the hook for the loan for 20, 30 years. They're really worried about neighborhoods changing. So they say, we're only going to loan if you do two things. You have to apply zoning to your neighborhood
Yeah.
to ensure that no new uses ever come in. It remains economically segregated. And they literally write that you have to put a racial covenant on the land so
Yeah.
that it can never become racially integrated. If it's a white neighborhood, it stays white. If it's a black neighborhood, it stays black. Like that is the condition of getting a federal loan. And it's
Yeah.
the New Deal that does it. And they do it for understandable reasons. They're worried about the properties changing value, but basically they're not willing to pay the price of having a dynamic society. They decide it's cheaper to just freeze things in place. And
Or
since
a
they don't have,
multicultural society, and it's also easier to not get that white opposition and white flight. So, hey, let's
it
just say
sure
this is
is.
how it
Yeah.
is, and we'll just do it.
We'll just reinforce the status quo. We're not
Yeah.
re-engineering society. We're just trying to stabilize the banks, but it freezes everything in place in a way that they really don't anticipate. So that's our second stage. The third series of progressives here that I'm taking aim at is a group in the 1970s. And this is a decade when both the right and the left revolt against big government. And I think often we think a lot more about the right wing revolt against big government, that had its roots in Goldwater, carries through the Reagan Revolution,
Yeah.
where he's governor in California and then takes it national. We know that story, right? There's also a left-wing revolt against big government, and it's people like Rachel Carson and Ralph Nader and Jane Jacobs, and they come in and
Yeah.
they say, look, we created big government in the New Deal to solve problems. It's been captured by big business. It's not solving our problems anymore. It's serving the interests of big corporations instead of the public. What we need is a way to make government defend the public, a way
Yeah.
to make government serve the public interest. And they have a simple solution that they roll out. They say, if you think the government is helping corporations instead of ordinary people, you should be able to sue to challenge the decisions of government. And they're
Which brings
imagining.
in, I think you call it localism.
Yeah, right.
And-
So it's like every local community should be able to make its own decisions. If it doesn't like the decision being imposed on it by government bureaucrats, it should be able to sue to challenge that. That sounds great, right?
Yeah,
Like
and a little, I love it when you can find an example that's not on our own shores that reinforces what you're saying. Well, I was reading that part of the book. I was thinking about what the Labor government is trying to do now to recapture what happened when they devolved to all local governments. And the unintended consequence is they don't have any housing because local, your local, whatever reason, we're preserving the green belt, we're preserving this and that, and the British can't build shit. They can't even finish a railway line because the localism has completely overtaken the ability to actually accomplish something on a larger scale. And I also want you to jump in from that to these people who were against sprawl and then created more sprawl by being against sprawl. I just love
Right.
that part of your book. So I want you to finish whatever your thoughts were, but I want you to go to sprawl. Anti-sprawl has created more sprawl, and tell us how that happened.
Yeah, that's exactly how, it's the same story as with Labour in the UK, that they're
Yeah.
they've become committed to a good idea, which is empower local communities.
Sure. Sounds
but it has
great.
these bad consequences. So
Yeah.
anti-sprawl in the US, they say, look, we're despoiling the last untouched places. What we need to do is to stop people from plowing under wild places and putting up housing.
Right.
But their mechanism is to say, well, you should have to have an environmental review for every project. You should be able to challenge that environmental review in court. They enact statutes, like out in California, environmental law that mandates these reviews. Well, that law, we have numbers on this, is almost exclusively used to stop the development of multifamily housing in dense urban areas. Like that's where people will sue. They'll say,
and that's again where progressives dive in head first. Hey, we're saving the land.
We're saving, but often the land is like the lot at your corner, or maybe it's the grass around the single family home, which is now going to be an apartment building. It's not used mostly to defend the wild places. And so what happens is it gets impossible to build where people actually want to live, where there's high market demand for those homes. And instead, people live further and further from their jobs. Commute times in America are getting a lot longer. It pushes the development out because you can't build in the center. And
I
so
remember the first time I ran
effect.
into the phrase I think it was somewhere in Arizona. I was talking to a young man who was looking for a house. He had just gotten a job there. And this was maybe 30 years ago. He gave me a phrase that I'd never heard before. And that was, from the city center, you have to drive until you qualify. In other words, you have to drive. And I said, what do you mean drive till you qualify? He says, well, I can't afford a house that's anything more than, like I have to be 30 miles out from the center of town till I can qualify for a loan, because that's when the prices, and that puts me a 2-hour commute from work on a freeway.
And that's crazy,
Yeah,
right? Like
it
nobody
is.
wants to be driving 2 hours in on the freeway.
Right.
But it's a trade-off that people will make to find that home and that community where they can raise their family. That's not how it used to work. Until 1970, people in America moved toward opportunity. They went to the places where the jobs were
Yeah.
being created. Since then, people have moved toward cheaper housing.
Yeah.
And you can find this really bright dividing line about 50 years ago. And that's when the rate of mobility falls. In 1970, 1 in 5
Yeah.
Americans moved every year. And today it's 1 in 13, right? So
Well, and you
it's this
also talk
very
about the
sharp
fact
fall.
that, okay, in Flint, Michigan, you can get a house for nothing, but there are no jobs there. So what's the point? And the mobility used to be connected to places you could afford to live and work.
Right. So it's not just an affordable housing crisis. I could afford a house in Flint. You could afford a house in Flint. Anyone watching this can afford a house in Flint. I know that because there are so many vacant homes in Flint. They're tearing them down. They don't
Yeah,
have
you
enough
walk the
takers for them.
streets there and doing research.
Yeah, I talked to people and I wanted to know, why do you stay in Flint? If you'd gone to Flint in 1920, if you'd gone to Flint in 1960, it was a great place to raise a family.
Yeah.
It had lots of jobs. People were pulling themselves up, and everybody in Flint is at most the grandkid of somebody who moved there, right? So
Who moved
mobility
there,
is in
yeah.
their blood. And yet there's still lots of people who live in Flint,
Well, now
even
they're
though
stuck. The quote, that's your book. I mean, they're stuck.
that's the thing. They're
Yeah.
stuck there.
Let me reintroduce you here and then we'll power forward because I have a lot more I want to ask you about. Um, so we are talking about an incredible book that I read on Kindle the day it came out. So I was one of the first readers, very pleased with that, getting ahead of the crowd. And it's called Stuck: How the Privileged and the Propertied Broke the Engine of American Opportunity. And what we are talking with the author, Yanni, about the book. And it comes from both familial experience on his part. There are family stories in there, there's stories of other people. But I just want to change gears here a little bit and get to the present tense on one thing, and then we can go back into the argument of the book. You actually say this in your book, that perhaps American mobility was merely a life stage in the growth of the Republic, an artifact of our restless youth. Okay, so you make that statement. And then I have a question that sort of connects with that. And this is not a loaded question. It's a real question. I'm not trying to make a point. Will the Musk GOP deregulate building codes and zoning in a way that opens up housing to the 1930s, 40s, and 50s standards again? I don't know. I've followed the program pretty closely, what these guys are saying, if one can follow it. I don't know if that's one of their things in terms of opportunity, but I'm guessing that the MAGA right is kind of on a local level, just like everybody else. They want to keep anybody they don't like out of their neighborhood, and they're building fences and sending troops to the southern border. But on the other hand, when it comes to your own town and your own neighborhood, one of my neighbors, who, by the way, is a wonderful friend of mine and makes stuff for me, who also had big Trump signs on his lawn. Our bridge was just reconstructed with new painted lines where we used to be able to drive in the right-hand lane to make the turn into our neighborhood, but now they've made a bike lane. And we can't do that anymore. But every time I follow his pickup truck across the bridge going back to our neighborhood, he breaks the law and drives in the bike lane because, God damn it, who's going to tell me what to do? Now, I can imagine him looking at zoning for my little neighborhood saying, fuck it. If I want to build a second story on my house for my grandchild, I'm going to do it. Who are you to tell me what to do? So part of that MAGA pushback, does it have something to do with this? In the sense of feeling restricted and stuck. And if these guys keep winning, is one little silver lining, I'm not a big MAGA fan, but is a silver lining that at least some of the crazy libertarianism these tech bros bring of don't regulate us, we're going to build the future, will they throw a sop to the young couple trying to buy a place and say, why should they be excluded from a neighborhood because the zoning laws are written in a way that excludes new buildings? I'm just throwing that out. It's a real question. It's just, I hadn't really thought about it till I read your book, but it's come up now. And I just want to get your feedback.
Yeah, no, look, it's a great question, and I think you're pointing to a real problem here, which is that this is something progressive jurisdictions have done to themselves.
Yeah.
In red states, in red cities, you don't tend to find the same kind of restrictive zoning because there isn't the same belief in the power of the government to do good. This is sort of zoning is almost like an autoimmune disease, right? Like it's people who believe the government could do good gave a little bit too much authority and a little bit too much regulation intended well, but has ended up attacking the things that progressives say they value, right? It's attacking diversity, it's attacking equality, it's attacking the ability of people to move up, and so in red areas you find less of it. But there's some feedback effects here, right? So blue areas are the ones that are growing fast economically. It's where the jobs are, it's where the opportunities are, it's where kids do better than their parents did. And so you've got a divide in this country where lots of the communities which have lots of opportunity are in they're blue cities, whether they're in red states or blue states, but it's almost impossible to live there because you can't afford to. 50 years ago, a janitor in Alabama who moved to San Francisco does so much better in San Francisco that they end up ahead. Today, that janitor in Alabama who moves to San Francisco will earn more in San Francisco, but they'll pay so much more in rent and housing costs that they'll end up behind. They'll have less in their bank account at the end of every month. And so you end up with part of the country feeling really resentful and angry at the progressive areas that they can see are thriving and prosperous, and they're not welcome there. And then you've got these islands of blue prosperity that have walled themselves off. So, it's part of what's fueled Trump's rise, I think. And there's a question about what he does about it. One of the first executive orders he signed took aim at housing regulation. He's also talked about beautiful neighborhoods of single-family homes. We're not going to let those people in there. The Trump fortune came after World War II out of building housing in New York for middle-class families who wanted to move up in the world. And so he's got that. They also settled a lawsuit about excluding minorities, right? So he's got both
and
halves
his
of the
dad
heritage
did. He and his father settled a lawsuit on that. So, well, I mean, it's sort of a weird thing because on one hand, it's anti-immigration down to the core. On the other hand, it's like the no zoning thing could open up the neighborhood again. So there's a kind of a contradiction there. Let me go to something that you write in your book here. This hostility to change was a fundamentally conservative impulse, but on its own, it merely slowed the progress toward greater equality. I want to talk about the kind of implication of what you're writing about, because of course, and again, this isn't specifically what your book is about, but it's kind of an elephant in the room, because in a way, your book about mobility is also an argument for a multicultural, diverse culture. And it became that because of the mobility. So there may have been restrictions on a push to try to get the Jews back into the Lower East Side, or Black Americans back into their neighborhood. But the fact of the matter is those restrictions were never completely successful because people did kind of escape. And the mobility and the housing prices helped them in spite of some of the mistakes that FDR made in kowtowing to the white majority, et cetera. So now I want to kind of jump ahead. And in the best of all possible worlds, if everybody read your book and people that were able to make changes read it, if Elon Musk sits down and reads your book, which he should, because he's a pronatalist and wants more babies, and where is everybody going to live? And I'm not being facetious about that. We've talked to a lot of pronatalists on this show who've written books on this and demographics. It's all part of one question. So in terms of the kind of culture we would be living in, if Trump called you and said, okay, besides Elon Musk standing by my desk, Yanni, I want you here to tell me how to navigate this. It'd be a good idea if you would, by the way, if anybody's listening. What specific changes could we make in America, both culturally in terms of heart and mind, but also legally, to wrest back the control from some of the localism that has stymied housing prices and made them unaffordable, and also made changes to the kind of zoning laws that would not then create complete chaos, but on the other hand, really get back to opportunity again. I remember, I think it was on one of the programs you did recently on Morning Joe, or somebody asked you, about venture capital people snapping up neighborhoods. And you said, well, if these things changed appropriately, they would be out of business, because the only reason they can do this is because we've created a housing scarcity. But if we did the things I want to do, we would be out of that scarcity. So I want to get to that. I want to get to the things we could do. If your book implies what we should be doing, what is that?
Yeah, and the first one is abundance, right? What you were just talking about. We need a lot of housing. So how do we get a lot of housing? The simplest change we can make is that zoning is legally a state level issue. It's not the feds. It's not even the cities and towns. They get their power delegated by the state.
Right.
There are other places on earth that manage to grow without driving their housing prices through the roof. One way they do it is by having much more standard rules. So Japan, for example, has 12 zoning labels. And any town or city in Japan that's applying them can choose one of those 12 labels. New York, by the time you layer on all the special districts, has a couple hundred. It makes it much more complicated. So you can simplify and standardize the rules at the state level and say, look, localities can still decide, like, the industry goes over here, the commercial area is over here. It doesn't need to be total chaos, but you can really simplify down the categories. And that does all kinds of good things. It makes it easy to, right now, if you're a home builder who figures out how to build in Boston, it doesn't help you in New York because it's a whole different playbook. So you can't take the solutions to scale.
Yeah.
So that's one solution, is just simplify the rules and standardize them over broad geographic areas, and let people build as of right, so that if you can file something which says, hey, I'm following the rules here.
Yeah.
I can build, and you're not waiting on approvals. And that just speeds it up, and time is money in construction. And so it also really lowers housing costs really fast.
Well, when it comes to when it comes to the progressive, one thing I want to throw in and then continue with your answer is a kind of a fake environmentalism when, wink, wink, nod, nod, we're using nice words. It's sort of like, taking rights away from women in the name of feminism somehow. We're going to use the words environmentalism to achieve something that has nothing to do with the actual environment, but has to do with the fact we don't want our view spoiled, or we don't want people like you living in our neighborhood. How do we push back, and then get back to your main answer here? How do we push back as a kind of a parenthetical piece of this against this left-wing American progressive knee-jerk kowtowing to anything that comes labeled as environmental? And really, the intent in so many instances, as we look at across the board, is really a culture war fact, or it's really nothing to do with the good of the environment a lot of the time. And I think that this has given tremendous credibility to some of the MAGA pushback, not in the sense that they're credible, but once again, when your own side, because I consider myself a progressive, is sort of wink, nod, nod, accept lies because they're useful sometimes. This hasn't helped us. How do you push back against that? How do we just say, hey, look, this isn't environmentalism. This is just localism and NIMBYism.
Look, down the road from where I live, there's a big parking lot, an empty parking lot next to a subway station, where people have been trying to build multifamily housing. And it's been blocked on environmental grounds because of the runoff, or because of that there's some open space there. If you think about the bigger picture, it would be good for the environment if you built multifamily housing next to a transit station. That's good. It has now been, I'm not making this up, 25 years since the development was first proposed, and it's still in the review process. That's not good for anyone. And I think people can look at that and they say, well, this is not sincere. It's not advancing the aims of the environmental movement. It's a rigged game, right? To use Trump's language. And people have that perception because it often is. And so that's the other part of the solution here, is that you can ask people this question two ways. If you ask them, do you want a new apartment building on your block? They'll say no. And you know what? They're not wrong to say no at that level. It might make parking a little harder. It might block some of their views. There might be real harms. But if you ask them about it, that's where our minds go first. We think, what am I losing in this process?
And just like you talked about the private equity people on Morning Joe, one thing I want to throw out here is there are some very interested parties that want to keep this going, because there are immense amounts of money to be made by the legal profession in this area of law of suing, so that, much as the lie is given to some of the equity and inclusion stuff by the fact that there's a whole substrata of people who have made millions of dollars out of training corporations to do equity and inclusion. They didn't include any more people, but those guys got rich training people to pretend they were doing it. And there was a fakery to it. Again, that's not the whole story, but it has degraded the language, just like the word environmentalism is degraded by people using it in a fake way. How about these myriad lawyers and firms and lobbyists who do nothing but throw in their lot with people who are stalling buildings for 20 years, where people
if you make everything everything a matter of government approval, you are encouraging government corruption
Yeah.
because all of those industries are going to do everything they can to get those regulators to side with them.
Yeah.
And it becomes enormously lucrative for them and sometimes, unfortunately, lucrative for the public officials. So it's not a good system. What you can shift to is you can ask people the same question in a different way. You can say, do you want young families to be able to live in your neighborhood? Do you want doctors, not, you know, the doctors and the lawyers are here. Do you think that the nurses and the firefighters and the daycare workers who serve
Well,
this
how about it,
community?
your own kid being able to afford a house down the block?
Yeah, do you want your own kid? Do you want your grandkids to live within
Yeah,
walking distance so you
exactly.
can go over and see them? If you ask people that, they say, heck yeah, that's what I
Yeah.
want. That's good.
Yeah.
So you've got to get people to stop focusing on what they lose from new development, which is
Yeah.
where our minds naturally go, and ask them about what they stand to gain. And if you can do that, that's the cultural shift, right? If we
Yeah.
if we lived in a culture that was optimistic and open because we felt like the future would be better than the past, and we felt that way because we were always starting over and always moving to new places
Yeah.
ourselves. And that American optimism carried us through a couple centuries. And we've lost hold of it because we're stuck, because too many Americans want to move and can't.
Yeah.
And if you can get the cultural change, it starts building on itself. You let people move to prosperous places, they get a sense of agency in their own lives. They start to feel as if it's not a zero-sum game. Your gain doesn't have to come at my expense. You restore that American optimism, and it goes an
Mhm.
awfully long way.
One of the things in your book, I think this is from later in the book, down on page 219 or something. By 2023, California's area of limits had so constricted the supply of housing that the median price of a single family home in the state topped 900,000, more than 10 times the median household income. The money that purchased an entire house in 1970, adjusted for inflation, would now barely suffice to buy a pair of parking spots in a garage in San Francisco. And I just thought
It's
that was
crazy.
a well-written sentence, but it really sums up what you're trying to say here.
If you price people out of opportunity, then they will leave. And California was a state which, for almost its entire history, was mostly filled with
Yeah.
Americans who have been born someplace else.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
today, it's bleeding population.
Hey,
And
my
that's
wife's
crazy.
family, her father's from North Dakota. His dad was a blacksmith. Her mom was from Arkansas. They moved to California in 1947 after both serving in the war. And he went to school, became a lawyer, did his thing, bought a house. This is the whole deal. And this is what you're talking about. I just want to interject one thing here. We have a book club called It Has to Be Read, which keys off my commentary. It has to be said. And we'd like to make your book our April book, our book club
Oh,
book in
wow.
April. And
Oh,
before I
wow. Thank you so
forget,
much.
and in April, get you back to talk about it and bring somebody else with you if you want. And we're going to keep going a little bit here. I'm not winding up yet, but unless I forget, when I do sign off eventually here and say goodbye to you, please stick around for a few minutes and talk to my producer, Ernie, because we'd like to ask you if there's somebody else we'd ought to be talking to about your field or any subject. It could be, a fellow writer, a student, somebody in another subject we may not know about. So please just stick around and give Ernie ideas for future guests.
Will do.
We would value that. Let me just jump to a kind of an overarching question in terms of a little futurology here. We're in the shakeout period of the second Trump administration and all this stuff going on, and closing government agencies are trying to. And I kind of asked you this before, but I'm going to ask it again. Is this a little bit of an answer to some of the progressive misdeeds when it came to overregulation across the board, of which your subject is a part? Or is that over
Yeah.
optimistic thinking?
No, I mean, I think the Trump administration may push us sometimes in healthy directions. That's not to say that I approve of many of its individual actions, but you know, I think many voters, right? The man won a plurality of votes. He won those votes because he was tapping into real frustrations, and I think many Americans looked at government, looked at the regulatory process, looked at their own lives, and they said something is not working the way we thought it would.
Right.
And they were not wrong about that.
Yeah.
And we may get some useful correctives. We may get some overcorrections. That
Yeah.
tends to happen when we switch partisan control of government. People overinterpret their mandates. They go a little too far.
Yeah.
And I'll just tell you that I'm a little alarmed at how the small credit that Trump and Doge and Musk seem to give to many civil servants who really do try to make the lives of their fellow Americans better.
Well,
But they're
I
not
get my
wrong.
Social
There's
Security
too much
payment every
sometimes.
month. I'm 72 and I'm on Medicare and it's working for Jeannie and me. I hope they're not firing all those people or firing everybody at the IRS that collects the taxes and so forth and so on. I agree with you. But on the other hand, it's interesting because just looking at my neighborhood, this is a pretty left-wing neighborhood up here north of Boston, but we have our Trump voters. And I think when I think about these people who are the Trump voters in our neighborhood, they tend to be a little more on the working class side, perhaps, although
Yeah.
that's not the case with a couple of them. But I think all of them have had at some point in their life a run-in with what I would call an intransigent bureaucracy that was unreasonable. And they're just sick of it. They're sick of the extra paperwork for the insurance forms. They're sick of the fact that they just got their home inspected again by the insurance people who told them to re-roof their house, but they know plenty about roofing and it's only 15 years old and there's some moss on the north side. But of course there's moss on the north side. But how do you, when you multiply this level of frustration of this culture of ours, I kind of get why folks voted for Trump. And I
There's a
also
sense
don't look at all of these guys as fascist enemies who
there's a
have,
sense of helplessness that comes, right? When the
yeah.
when a government bureaucrat tells you, you can't fix your own house, um, it's disempowering.
But the left has
And
been all about government regulation, and they're not unfairly saddled with that. And I think the equity and inclusion folks were the final straw with a lot of people because it was like now I'm getting called a racist, or I'm told I have to perform some sort of a ceremony to mourn the fact that this used to be a clamshell place that the Pequots would collect their clams on, and and if I don't apologize for that, somehow I'm an immoral person, though nobody's giving any land back. I just think any individual instance of this stuff, the kind of moralistic hand wringing over settlement, which of course is global. Nobody would be anywhere if they hadn't settled someplace. Every place any human is, except for the very first people to get somewhere, someone else was there first. But that said, I don't know what your feeling is, but I'm very frustrated by the present moment. I work very hard to get Democrats elected. But on the other hand, I think that the proper attitude right now for people of my persuasion is some introspection and humility in terms of how did we drive everyone so fucking crazy that they vote for this guy who, is such an extremist. And he seems to be getting a lot of support when you look at the polls. And I think
I
that
think,
support has a lot to do with your book. I think it's a pushback of feeling stuck.
yeah, and if you take that step back and you say, okay, we've had these rules for decades, has our society
How's it working?
given more opportunity to people who come from historically disadvantaged communities?
Yeah,
Is it growing more equal? Do Americans feel more in control of their lives? We had all the regulations that were supposed to get us there. And what I'm asking readers to do is to take a step back and to say, okay, I know what these things were supposed to do. Is that
yeah,
what's working out? Are we actually protecting the environment or are we driving sprawl? Are we actually advancing equality or are we entrenching inequality? The goals are not bad.
right.
But too often, the ways that progressives have gone about trying to achieve those goals have been counterproductive at best or pretextual at worst, right? Is exactly what you were pointing to, the sort of sense that often people are profiting off of this. They're
Mm.
not really pursuing the goal itself. They've just figured out a way to get their slice. And that anger that generates is real. And I think progressives are going to have to take a step back and say, okay, if these are our actual goals, are we going about it the right way?
Well, and the
Or,
progressives have been part of an entire professional class that has worked hard to keep everything the same.
yeah,
Let's not change anything because we're in power. It's if you're on the board of Harvard and you have $500 billion of endowment and you're sitting in Cambridge, I'm interested that you made Cambridge an example of how regulated everything was in terms of keeping people out. I mean, this is the epicenter of progressive America and elite institutionalism, and it's one of the most regulated and least free places when it comes to housing that you could have named outside of California,
yeah, and it was a working class town once, right? It
as
was
you
a
told
factory
in your
town.
book.
And it isn't now. And that's a pretty big change. It used to be that the Democratic Party was really rooted in working class communities.
What does that have to do with Harvard University specifically? In the same way that you could say about Californian cities, what does it have to do with the tech industry? I mean, how did Google and all these guys change San Francisco from a place of opportunity where my father-in-law went in 1947 precisely because he could afford to live there as the son of a blacksmith, to what it is today, which is exclusionary and oppressive, and as people would see it who try to come in for get a job. And what is the philosophical kind of worldview of the kind of people who live in Cambridge and work for Harvard University and are part of that system, that they've been so blind to what you're writing about? What is, I'm going to put it in a horribly pejorative way, what's wrong with these people?
I think too many people, having achieved their slice of the American dream, they pull the ladder of opportunity up behind them. They love what they have, and they rationalize that they're protecting it, they're preserving it, and they don't see how they're not giving other people their shot at achieving that same dream. And as Democrats have become the party of the establishment to a large extent, certainly the party of the professional classes. That has been a problem for the Democratic Party, that it has ceased to focus as much on helping people move up and focused a little bit more on maintaining the status quo. And that's a dangerous place for any political party to find itself.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm going to wrap this up and just once again say what this was. In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, my guest was Yoni Appelbaum, and his book is Stuck, and it is our April offering for our book club. I just think it's a terrific book, and you've opened an entire can of worms. The timing on this book is perfect because, you're writing about change at a time of massive change. You're writing about pushing back against overregulation when this is the headline every day of every newspaper in the country and online podcast. So congratulations. I know you didn't do that part on purpose, but you were right there with something that needs to be said. So just before we get out, remind you to stay and talk to Ernie for a minute with future guests. Is there something that you would like to say or cover here that perhaps I didn't get to, that I should have asked a question about?
No, I just say that I'm optimistic about the future, that I can sense that things are already starting to change, and that this is a problem of relatively recent construction. And that's good news because it means it can be relatively easily reversed.
In terms of that, one last question from Ernie. He texted me this. In view of what you've written and an optimism for the future, what is the role of the media in an age of disinformation overload? Because we have so much coming at us. How can we pick out what you're saying and say, yeah, but he's right about this? And, this isn't part of that disinformation.
I hope people will pick up the book for themselves and read it in April as part of the book club, because you should go and you should do your own research, and you should take a look at it and say, does this hold up to scrutiny? That ultimately, don't take it on my authority. Read it for yourselves, and I'd love to hear from all of your listeners what they think.
Yeah, isn't it ironic that all the, quote, historic buildings we love best, and the old neighborhoods we love best, and the old towns we think are wonderful, and that we do historic preservation efforts to keep the way they are, were built without building permits by people who were mostly building themselves with their cousin who helped them put the roof on, with no zoning and absolutely no health and safety stuff whatsoever. And these are our treasured communities that we don't want anybody to change. And then, we throw up all this, 2x4 sheetrock stuff that's zoned correctly and safety. And the first big storm comes along, it's all gone. Whereas my old brick house has been here forever and isn't moving because it was built by ordinary people who were building for themselves and not for the building inspector.
Yeah, there's a lesson in there.
Mm-hmm. Hey, this has been great. Everybody go buy the book. It's Stuck. It's really, really, really important. It's ripped from the headline, and it is our April offering. Please give Ernie some idea on guests. And this has really been a pleasure. I love your book, and I'm so appreciative that you wrote it.
Thank you so much.
This has been great. Thank you so much. Okay,
Take care.
bye.